Okay, so if you're anything like me, you start a lot of things and you finish some of them. And so recently I did a video about how to get started on projects, and a lot of the comments said, what about finishing though? And I feel like that's a trickier subject because you're never going to do anything without starting. But there are some things that it's just not worth finishing. And it can be kind of difficult to tell the difference between the two of them when you first thinking about a project. So in this video, we're going to talk about a system for learning to finish things, whether that's like a workout regime, a book, something you're making, or like foreign language fluency. But before we can start, we need to talk about the paradox of finishing. So here's the thing, you are always going to start more things than you finish, but finishing things is also a habit you want to get into, and you can't decide what you're going to finish on like a case-by-case ad hoc basis because there's a chance of you breaking the habit. So what do? Well, I think a guy called Scott Young, who's learned a bunch of languages and written a bunch of books, has a great answer to this. And his answer is to make a distinction between what he calls experiments and commitments. So basically, experiments are fine to quit. As Young puts it, the purpose of an experiment is to gather information, but also to kind of lower the barrier to entry to trying new things. So if you decide to join a martial arts class, or maybe you decide you're going to write a series of novels about a ninja who joins a band, and if you decide you're not into it after a couple of days or a week, you can just quit with no judgment attached. Commitments, on the other hand, need to be carried out to the end, or at least to whatever end point you've set yourself so that you don't break the habit of finishing. So for instance, if you decide to commit yourself to writing every day for a month, then that's something you have to do no matter what. And you can make this distinction with pretty much anything. So recently I've been mentally categorizing books as either experiments or commitments. So if there's a book, if I feel like I might like, then I'll start reading it as an experiment, and I'll give it 50 pages before I decide whether to drop it or not. But if there's a book that's recognized as a classic in its field and I really want to read it, I'll commit to finishing it, whether it's a difficult read or not. Or you could try a fitness class as an experiment and then decide never to go to it again after the first time you're doing it. But if you make a commitment to something like a 4-week training program, then you have to stick to it no matter what. By the way, a good point that Young makes is that you should start out by labeling experiments with short time periods to start out with. You don't really want to commit to a goal that's like a couple of years away and then find out a couple of months in that you don't really like it and you need to refocus and then feel like you're a quitter because you abandoned it. So for instance, when Young first started learning Chinese, he committed to 3 months instead of fluency to see whether he actually wanted to put in the years of work to get to an advanced level. And that brings us to another important point, which is that you have to define finish. So one advantage that video games have over real life is that the finishing conditions are super clear. You either beat a boss or you collect 100 backpacks or whatever, and you get a little notification that lets you know that you're done with that particular challenge. The problem that comes up in real life is that there's no real equivalent of this. Like if you're learning a new piece on the piano, there's no clear finish line and there are basically infinite ways to polish it or make it better. So you're going to have to decide for yourself what finished actually means, and that's probably going to change between projects. And you can do this in a bunch of ways, but I think the best two are to either decide how much time you're going to commit to the project or decide on the output that you want to create from the project. So time is kind of simpler, but I think it's important to break down what that actually looks like. So rather than commit to practicing like a foreign language for a month, you need to define what that looks like day to day. Is it half an hour twice a week? Is it 5 minutes a day? Or is it like vocab practice every day and then like an hour of conversational stuff on the weekends? I also think it's a good idea to keep the goal within your own control as much as possible. So loads of people set the goal of getting their blue belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, but that's kind of an arbitrary goal in a lot of ways. Blue belt standards really differ between academies and life can get in the way. And maybe if you miss a grading, it's going to take you like 2.5 years instead of 2. And even if your goal is go 3 times a week for 3 months, life can get in the way. So I'd suggest a goal that's like go to 50 lessons or do 100 rounds of sparring. That way, however long it takes, it's completely within your control, and then the results are going to hopefully come along from that. And then with piano, I use a mixture of time commitments and outputs. So in my second year of piano, for instance, I really wanted to play around with a bunch of styles, and so I spent about a week each on about 40 different pieces, where I just practiced them for 10 minutes a day to see how polished I could get them. And then I'd not worry about them again after that week. But then with the pieces that I really commit to, my definition of completing them is more like playing the whole thing through with about 98% accuracy at the intended tempo. Or to make it even simpler, but kind of more scary, it might be playing them in public to like a standard that I'm reasonably happy with. And this brings us to a way of thinking about finishing, which I think is incredibly useful, which is sending it. So I think the first time I heard anybody tell me to send it was in a climbing gym. And there it's sort of slang to just not be afraid to look like you're trying really hard at something and push through and try and finish a route. And now I think about sending it more generally as just putting in the effort to put something out into the world in a form that you're sort of reasonably happy with. So on the piano, that might mean doing a public performance, but it might also mean just filming a piece in one take and like sharing it with a friend or keeping it for yourself. But if you're writing, it really just means getting to the end of whatever you're writing, putting a conclusion on it and doing at least one version that reads completely through with like a beginning, a middle and an end. And then what you do with that V1 is really up to you. You can keep it in a folder and just be happy that it's done, or you can publish it anonymously, like on Reddit or somewhere else. Or you can publish it under your name and add it to like an online body of work that's hopefully going to build and grow. There's an illustrator I really like called Matt Shanks who has a great take on this, which is that when something is finished, it's something that people can begin to respond to. No one can say you wrote a great story if the story only has a beginning and a middle. No one can love your painting, including you, if you've stopped at the underpainting. The response might be what guides you to your next project. It's feedback to say, do more of that please, that added value to my life. And if you get the opposite response, that still might be the key to unlocking your next project or moving your practice forward in some way. Like when I did the starting video and everybody said, what about finishing though? And again, one great way to do this is by making a public commitment to putting something out into the world regularly. Whether that's like a YouTube channel or a newsletter, link in the comments, or like showing your work in an art class or testing your skills in like a tournament or a race. But even if you don't want to go full send in public, I think it's really useful to get a V1 done and put it in a folder that says you're done with it for right now. Or just test yourself in the gym and write down where you got to so you've got a record of it. And then you've got something to build from, which is really key to the final part of finishing, which is to become a finisher. Because the thing is, there are lots of tiny finish lines in your life, whether you're aware of them or not. And building the habit of finishing things is one of the most important things you can do. And so I think something that's super helpful is to actually build up an image of yourself as a finisher or someone who finishes things by splitting almost everything you do into chunks with clearly definable finish lines. So for instance, staying healthy and in shape is kind of a lifelong endeavor. There isn't much point in spending 8 weeks chasing your perfect body if you just go back to lying on the couch again afterwards. But splitting your training up into chunks with a clear finish line can actually be super helpful. So for instance, I quite often do 8 weeks of training focused on doing something specific, like building up my squat or improving my 5K time. I don't usually set myself a goal, I just focus on the process rather than the result. And that means I'm always in control of whether I finish or not. Which means that over time I've built up an image of myself as like someone who can finish things. And you can split anything up that way. Maybe you write a book by finishing 50 smaller essays, or you finish learning one small part of a bigger skill and then you move on to the next part. The important thing is building the habit. And if you're looking for better ways to build habits, along with the systems and the ways of making tiny improvements that make them really sustainable, then I've got a video covering all that right here. I will see you over there.